In some ways, Akhenaten's strict religious ideology had its roots in his father's deification. The leap from Amenhotep III's exaltation of solar power to his son's exclusive worship of sunlight itself was a small, almost inevitable step. It is even conceivable that Akhenaten viewed the Aten not only as his divine protector, but as his actual father. Yet in most crucial aspects, Akhenaten's theology was unprecedented, breaking sharply from 17 centuries of established Egyptian religious tradition. Where earlier pharaohs emphasized their role in upholding Ma'at, Akhenaten claimed to exist within Ma'at like the gods themselves. Truth was no longer a universal standard outside the king. Instead, it was defined solely by his will. Traditional ceremonies of royal renewal, like the Sed and Opet festivals, had marked periodic rejuvenation for the king, to be repeated at set intervals. But Akhenaten's Sed festival at Ipit-Sut, conducted while he was still Amenhotep IV, carried an entirely different significance. It proclaimed the permanent rejuvenation of both king and cosmos. Through his joint rule with the Aten, Akhenaten intended to return the world to its original, pristine state immediately following creation. His universe was one of continual rebirth, mirroring the daily rise of the sun, governed by the divine triad of the Aten, the king, and his queen. While the doctrine was spiritually ambitious, its practical consequences were revolutionary. A god whose power radiated through light itself had no need for enclosed, shadowy sanctuaries, which had been central to Egyptian worship since the earliest days of civilization. The Aten demanded open-air temples, filled with offering tables piled high, with food for direct exposure to the god's rays. In truth, the entire city of Akhetaten was conceived as one grand temple to the Aten, where the visible sun could be honored at any hour. This concept was clearly reflected in the Aten's so-called royal name at the time of its jubilee in 1351. Written inside the cartouche typically reserved for kings, the name was actually a condensed declaration of the new belief system. Live, Arehorus of the two horizons, who rejoices on the horizon in his name of light, which is the Aten. Just as Akhenaten embodied light itself, so his city, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, became the site where God, king, and holy city were perfectly unified. Although, in theory, the Aten required neither temples nor a priesthood, Akhenaten could not personally conduct every act of worship, no matter how devoted he may have been. After all, he was both head of state and prophet of a new faith. Thus, following established precedent, he appointed a high priest of the Aten soon after relocating to Akhetaten. Merira, whose name meant beloved of Ra, emerged from obscurity. Like most of Akhenaten's closest associates, he owed his position entirely to the king, ensuring his unwavering loyalty. Merira's formal installation as high priest took place at the king's house in the central city. Akhenaten, accompanied by Nefertiti and their eldest daughter, Heretic, appeared on a richly adorned royal balcony, its cushions embroidered for the occasion. Dressed in a long white robe and decorative sash, Merira, attended by his household, approached the royal presence and knelt before the king as scribes diligently recorded every detail of the ceremony. Behind the scribes stood baton-wielding enforcers, ready to act should any disturbance arise. Police, like scribes, were a constant presence in Akhetaten's daily life. With a formal proclamation, the king confirmed Merira's appointment, met with universal acclamation. When the celebration quieted, Merira delivered his brief but devout speech of acceptance. Numerous are the rewards that the Aten knows to give, pleasing his heart. His friends then lifted him onto their shoulders and carried him from the palace in triumph. One of the major highlights of Merira's career came several years later, when he was awarded the Gold of Honor, the highest reward for a loyal servant. After the king draped multiple gold collars around his neck, the entire assembly was obliged to listen in attentive silence as Akhenaten delivered an extended, formal, and highly ceremonial speech. With its ritualized setting and carefully orchestrated actions, Merira's appointment as high priest brought to life a style of royal audience that has remained surprisingly consistent across millennia. His subsequent investiture served as another reminder of the age-old dynamic between absolute rulers and their submissive courtiers. Around the same time as Merira's rise to high priesthood, Akhenaten began to circulate a more developed articulation of his religious philosophy. This new doctrine, ominously titled the Teaching, was composed in the everyday, spoken language rather than the classical, more formal dialect of earlier times. It is widely believed to have been written by the king himself. Officially known as the Great Hymn to the Aten, this composition has been described as one of the most remarkable and magnificent pieces of poetry to have survived from the pre-Homeric world. Its ecstatic tone and vivid portrayal of the creator's power would later inspire other religious writings, including the Hebrew Psalms. By having the hymn carefully inscribed in the tombs of his top officials as a visible demonstration of loyalty to the regime, Akhenaten ensured its survival for posterity. It is worth quoting extensively, as nothing better conveys the rapturous joy that defined the king's religious vision. You shine forth in splendor upon the horizon of the sky, O living Aten, creator of life. When you rise upon the eastern horizon, you fill every land with your radiance. Majestic, resplendent, brilliant, high above all lands. Your rays encompass everything you have made. The earth glows when you appear on the horizon, and shine as Aten in the daylight. You chase away the darkness as you extend your beams. The two lands rejoice. All herds rest peacefully in their pastures. Trees and plants flourish. Birds take wing from their nests. Fish leap from the river in your presence. Your rays reach even the depths of the sea. How numerous are your works, though hidden from sight. Sole God, apart from whom none exists. You shape the earth by your will alone. All people, livestock, and creatures, all who walk on land, all who soar on wings. Your rays nourish every pasture. At your rising, they live and thrive because of you. You created the seasons to nurture all your creations. Winter to cool them, heat that they might feel your presence. The hymn's celebration of abundance and the splendor of creation found its visual counterpart in the lavish decoration of the royal palaces, with brilliantly painted walls, ceilings, and floors. Yet, for most of Akhetaten's ordinary inhabitants, these opulent displays were a distant reality. Cramped alongside the grand temples and palaces, the common people endured lives of hardship and deprivation. The skeletal remains they left behind reveal the severe strains of poor nutrition, chronic stress, and relentless physical labor. Some suffered permanent spinal injuries from carrying heavy loads day after day, while others spent long hours squatting or kneeling on earthen floors, laboring over furnaces to produce glass or metal in the city's workshops. Undernourished from childhood, both men and women were often stunted and plagued by debilitating illnesses like anemia. Over half the population perished before reaching their 20s, and few lived beyond their 40s. Most were dead by 35, laid to rest in shallow graves dug directly into the desert sand, marked only by modest stone cairns. A few cheap pots or worn-out trinkets might accompany them to the afterlife. This grim reality stood in stark contrast to the official doctrine of light, life, and beauty. Perhaps it is little surprise that many of Akhenaten's less privileged subjects continued to quietly honor the old gods, even under the scrutiny of the king's enforcers. Within the privacy of their humble homes, beloved deities such as Hathor, Bes, Taret, and even Ammonius still held a cherished place in daily life. Whether as a reaction to or as a consequence of the lingering devotion to the old gods, Akhenaten's religious vision became increasingly extreme. In the early years of his reign, while the royal court remained at Thebes, it was still permissible for officials such as royal butlers to include prayers to deities like Osiris and Anubis in their tombs. However, after relocating to Akhetaten, the Aten was rapidly exalted from being the supreme god to becoming the only god. All other deities were now denied recognition or legitimacy. Akhenaten was determined to enforce his vision across society. Priests were dismissed or reassigned. Temples were shuttered, and all financial and material resources were funneled into the service of the Aten. The height of Akhenaten's religious radicalism came in the 11th year of his reign, 1341 BCE, when the Atenist doctrine was officially purified. This revision eliminated any mention of deities other than Aten or Ra. Alongside this theological purge came an aggressive campaign against other gods, most notably Ammonius, whom Aten had displaced as creator and supreme deity. To erase Ammonius' presence from public memory, Akhenaten launched a state-directed wave of destruction. Across Egypt, from the Nile Delta to distant Nubia, teams of royal agents stormed tombs and temples, defacing sacred inscriptions and imagery. Carrying chisels and guided by cue cards with illustrations to assist illiterate laborers, they climbed obelisks to chip away at figures and names, erasing any mention of Ammonius Ra. Personal names containing the elements Ammonius or Mut were targeted as well. The official desecration extended so far that even the plural form of the word God was eliminated. Terrified by this religious crackdown, individuals scrambled to protect themselves, defacing or altering their own possessions, and even changing their names to avoid persecution. A scribe named Tammuz quickly changed his name to Ahmose. A priest named Merenith became Meri-Ra, only daring to resume his original name after Akhenaten's death. To many Egyptians, this campaign of destruction must have felt like a violent assault on their deepest hopes and long-held beliefs. Yet Akhenaten remained unwavering, his doctrine uncompromising. The Aten was not only the sole god, but salvation itself was possible only through Akhenaten, throne name Nefertiti, and his family. His teaching proclaimed, "There is no one else who knows you, only your son, Nefertiti, the sole one of Ra. You have revealed your plans and your might to him. All those who have lived since you created the earth have been raised up for your son, the one born from your body, the dual king who lives by truth, Lord of the two lands. Nefertiti, sole one of Ra, the son of Ra who lives by truth, Lord of diadems. Akhetaten, whose life is long, and the king's great wife, his beloved, Lady of the two lands. Nefertiti, living in youthful forever and ever." The final verses of the great hymn to the Aten highlight one of the most remarkable aspects of Akhenaten's revolutionary reign. In some respects, Nefertiti was following a tradition already established by earlier women of the 18th dynasty. From Tetisheri, Ahotep, and almost Nefertiti to Hatshepsut, royal women had grown accustomed to playing influential roles in political life. Tai, Akhenaten's mother, advanced this even further by engaging in diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers and appearing alongside Amenhotep III, embodying a divine partnership with him. However, Nefertiti took this to unprecedented heights from the very beginning. At Ipit Sut, she was granted her own sanctuary, the mansion of the Benben, where her husband did not even appear. She was depicted performing rituals previously reserved for the king alone, such as striking down enemies or reviewing captives. On the boundaries steely commemorating the royal couple's first visit to Akhetaten, Nefertiti is portrayed at the same scale as Akhenaten, signifying equal status. Akhenaten's accompanying him further emphasized her elevated position. Great in the palace, beautiful of face, adorned with the twin plumes, Lady of joy who receives praises. One delights to hear her voice, the beloved great wife of the king, mistress of the two lands. Every act Akhenaten performed to honor the Aten was mirrored by Nefertiti. When he changed his name from Amenhotep, she also added an epithet to hers. As Akhenaten embodied Shu, the son of the creator god, Nefertiti represented Tefnut, Shu's consort. She adopted Tefnut's distinct flat-topped crown as her own, making it a symbol of her authority. In the tomb of her chief steward, the couple are depicted standing side by side, their figures almost merging into one. To some, Nefertiti and Akhenaten appeared as inseparable co-rulers on earth, complementing the Aten in heaven. Their close bond became a central theme of Akhenaten's religious vision, showcased in statues and reliefs across the city. In one scene, they are shown holding hands during an official ceremony. In another, Nefertiti sits on Akhenaten's lap as she fastens a bead necklace around his neck. A temple relief fragment even portrays them getting in a bed together. Their daughters were also prominently featured in official imagery. Within 2 years of settling in Amarna, Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters. Although Akhenaten fathered at least one son with a lesser wife, this son was conspicuously absent from official depictions, as the feminine principle was emphasized. A well-known stela shows the royal family at leisure with their 3 eldest daughters. Akhenaten cradles and kisses Meritaten. Akhetaten sits on Nefertiti's knee, reaching out to her father, and young Ankhesepitan tugs playfully at her mother's earring. Such open displays of affection and emotion within the royal family were entirely without precedent. The motivation behind this dramatic break from tradition lay in the new role the royal family assumed within Egyptian religion. They had become a sacred family, displacing the traditional pantheon of gods. The royal chariot rides through the heart of the city replaced the former processions of deities. Statues of Akhenaten and Nefertiti took the place of divine images. Since Atenism was an exclusive faith revealed solely to Akhenaten and his family, ordinary people seeking blessings from the sun god had to approach its earthly representatives as intermediaries. In the tombs of favored officials, carved into the cliffs surrounding Akhetaten, personal identity was subsumed beneath the worship of the king. The traditional offering prayers, once directed to Osiris, the god of the dead, were now dedicated to the king, and sometimes to Nefertiti as well. The only form of eternal existence now offered was to enjoy the Aten's rays during daylight, partake in temple offerings, and return to one's tomb at night under Akhenaten's watchful gaze. Within their homes, Akhetaten's residents kept statues and images of the royal family in private shrines. The scale of these household sanctuaries became a public display of loyalty to the regime, as significant a status symbol as a well-stocked granary, a private well, or a lush garden. For the common people who were excluded from the Aten's formal temples, there was at least one place open for worship in the city center, a chapel dedicated to the king's statue. Yet not everyone embraced this absolute devotion to Akhenaten and his religious reforms. Hints from the earliest boundary stele suggest that discontent may have arisen during the early years of his rule. Akhenaten's radical changes likely stirred strong opposition among certain groups, and the threat of rebellion was a constant concern. Loyal officials warned would-be dissenters of the king's resolve to suppress any opposition. As soon as he rises, he exerts his power against those who ignore his teachings. Even within his new capital, Akhenaten's personal security remained a major concern, and Akhetaten was heavily guarded. In addition to the police, soldiers and army commanders constantly surrounded His Majesty. Each day, Akhenaten's chariot rides through the city were escorted by armed guards bristling with spears. Behind the king's residence, an entire city block was allocated to barracks housing paramilitary forces, supplemented by additional garrisons throughout the city. A complex system of pathways crisscrossed the plain, allowing the desert behind Akhetaten to be patrolled efficiently. Visible both day and night, these routes enabled military chariots to maintain round-the-clock security. The desolate terrain of the eastern desert provided convenient hiding places for outlaws, and the authorities were ever vigilant for dissidents who would join those in the desert hills. Mobile police patrols kept constant watch over the royal palace from high on the surrounding plateau, while the steep cliffs behind the residence made it nearly impossible to approach or escape with ease. Like many autocrats throughout history, Akhenaten placed great trust in the loyalty of his security forces, especially his chief of police. Mahu, like all of the king's senior officials, owed his entire career to royal favor and was careful to show his unwavering allegiance. His tomb walls were adorned with no fewer than 4 versions of the hymn to the Aten, the official doctrine of Akhenaten's new faith. Mahu's public demonstrations of loyalty in the king's presence were textbook examples of flattery. Yet even in such an atmosphere of constant suspicion, total control of security was not entrusted to any one person. Akhenaten also maintained a personal guard composed of elite soldiers, including foreigners who were perhaps less likely to bear personal grievances against him. Some of the top administrative figures may also have come from non-Egyptian backgrounds. The vizier Aparel, the royal physician Pentu, and the chamberlain Tutu are all thought to have had foreign ancestry. Although the royal family was regarded as divine on earth and the sole channel to salvation, they still had to look beyond their own people to secure unquestioning loyalty. The last grand public appearance of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their 6 daughters took place in 1342 during the 12th year of his reign, in a spectacular royal durbar. Seated together beneath a sunshade, they observed as foreign dignitaries filed past, offering exotic gifts. These tributes served as a vivid display of the king's far-reaching power, likened to the all-encompassing radiance of the sun, as the official account described it. The appearance of the dual king Nefertiti and his great wife Nefertiti upon the great electrum palanquin to receive the tribute of Syria and Kush from the west and the east, with every foreign land gathered on this single occasion offering their gifts to the king. Not every foreign ruler appreciated this extravagant demonstration of Egyptian supremacy. In a sharply worded letter to Akhenaten, King Ashurballit of Assyria protested, "Why should my messengers be forced to stand constantly in the sun and die beneath its rays?" How ungrateful, it seemed, for the Assyrian envoy to object to such generous exposure to the Aten's life-giving light. Divine favor had its limits. The foreign envoys had scarcely departed from Akhetaten when tragedy struck the royal household. Akhenaten's second daughter, Akhetaten, passed away at the young age of 7, followed not long after by the death of the king's deeply cherished mother Tai. As Akhenaten had decreed, both were buried in the royal tomb, cut into the hills of a remote desert valley to the east of the city, 8 miles away. Vivid scenes of mourning etched into the tomb walls capture the profound grief of their family. The final depiction of Nefertiti in Akhetaten shows her weeping over her deceased daughter. After this, she vanishes entirely from the historical record. Perhaps she fell victim to the same misfortune that claimed her mother-in-law and child. Or perhaps Akhenaten, now confronted by death so close to home, re-evaluated her role. Soon after Nefertiti's disappearance, Akhenaten appointed a co-regent. The new co-ruler bore the name Nefertiti, echoing part of Nefertiti's own royal name. It appears that Nefertiti herself had become king. Who better, who more trustworthy, to carry forward Akhenaten's revolutionary vision than his closest partner and ally? Akhenaten died following the autumn grape harvest of 1336, ending his 17-year reign. His burial in the royal tomb included symbolic and telling grave goods. Not surprisingly, he chose as an heirloom a 1,000-year-old stone vessel once owned by Khafra, builder of the Great Sphinx. More surprising, however, were the Shabdi figurines inscribed for Akhenaten himself, intended to serve him in an afterlife his own doctrine had long rejected. Even the most devout zealots, it seems, may harbor final moments of doubt. His stone sarcophagus was guarded at each corner not by the traditional 4 funerary goddesses, but by figures representing his beloved Nefertiti. Though Nefertiti would watch over his remains, she could not protect his legacy. Graffiti found in a Theban tomb dated to the 3rd year of Nefertiti's reign suggests the beginnings of reconciliation with the old Ammonius priesthood and possibly the reopening of a temple to Ammonius in his traditional stronghold. Even before Akhenaten's body had fully settled into its grave, the exclusive cult of Aten was already fading. Akhenaten's death threw the royal court and the entire country into a state of crisis. Loyalists who had depended on his patronage must have desperately hoped for his revolution, or at least his regime, to endure. Yet others, especially members of the powerful Ammonius priesthood who had quietly waited for his religious experiment to run its course, seized the chance to restore the old faith. Even within the royal family, uncertainty and division emerged. A short-lived ruler named Smenkhare briefly ascended the throne between 1333 and 1332. Perhaps he was an otherwise unknown son of Akhenaten. More likely, it was Nefertiti once more, now ruling alone under a new name, supported by Meritaten, who had been elevated to the role of great royal wife. But conservative forces were gathering strength and looked to the next generation for a ruler who carried royal blood, yet was young enough to be molded to their will. Hidden from public view for most of his life, Akhenaten's 9-year-old son by a lesser wife seemed the perfect choice. His marriage to Nefertiti's daughter, Akhetaten, further cemented his claim to power. The courtiers, priests, and military leaders reached a consensus. He would be king. His name was Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. Within months of a young pharaoh's ascension, those controlling the throne swiftly began steering Egypt back toward its ancient traditions. Under their careful direction, the king consented to change his name, publicly rejecting the Aten in favor of Ammonius. History had come full circle. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamen. His wife Akhetaten adopted the name Enkisenamen, meaning she lives for Ammonius. Soon after, a grand restoration decree was issued in the king's name. Proclaimed from Memphis, the traditional capital, the decree condemned Akhenaten's policies without naming him directly. When His Majesty came to power, the temples of the gods and goddesses, from Abu to the Delta marshes, lay in ruin. Their sanctuaries had crumbled, overgrown with weeds. The land was in distress. The gods had abandoned Egypt. Military campaigns sent to expand Egypt's borders in the Near East met with failure. Those who prayed for divine protection received no answer. The decree emphasized the gods in the plural, and the young king's actions reflected this shift. Temples were repaired, especially those dedicated to Ammonius-Re. Priesthoods were reinstated, and new cult statues were commissioned at the royal treasury's expense. In doing so, Tutankhamen was said to have restored what was broken and banished chaos from the two lands. The royal court's departure from Akhetaten and return to Thebes confirmed the complete restoration of the old order. To mark this decisive break with his father's radical experiment, the boy king, like earlier reunifiers, took the symbolic title Repeater of Births, signaling not a recreation but a renaissance. Yet so much promise was tragically cut short. Tutankhamen died in 1322, before even reaching adulthood. Perhaps he had secretly intended to rehabilitate Akhenaten's legacy once he reached full power. Perhaps those who truly held power feared this possibility and acted to prevent it. Or perhaps the frail young king simply succumbed to illness, like many of his subjects. His young wife attempted to continue the royal line, but her youth and the limited gene pool of a sibling marriage led to tragedy. 2 stillborn daughters were carefully mummified and buried beside their father in his hastily prepared tomb in the Valley of the Kings, waiting over 3,000 years to be rediscovered alongside his famed burial treasures. Tutankhamen's grieving widow understood the grim future that awaited her. As the last living descendant of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and of Amenhotep III's lineage, she held the keys to Egypt's throne. In a desperate attempt to escape her fate, she sent an unprecedented appeal to the Hittite king, pleading for him to send one of his sons to Egypt to marry her and rule alongside her. She wrote, "Never shall I take a servant of mine and make him my husband." The Hittite king was astonished, telling his court, "Nothing like this has ever happened to me before." Eventually, he agreed and sent a prince, Zenanza, south toward Egypt. But Zenanza never arrived, dying on his journey. Enkisenamen's worst fears were realized. She was forced into marriage with an elderly court official, a man old enough to be her grandfather, eager to claim power for himself. With her duty fulfilled, she too vanished from history, her fate unknown. Thus ended the Thutmoside dynasty, one of Egypt's most illustrious royal lines, which had produced powerful conquerors and brilliant rulers. The golden age of Amenhotep III was now only a distant memory. Egypt, weakened abroad and dispirited at home, needed strong leadership to restore its glory. As it happened, there remained one institution and one man at its helm, ready to provide that leadership. Egypt's expanding engagement in foreign affairs profoundly reshaped both the nation and its governance. Increased contact with foreign peoples and cultures brought new ideas and customs into Egyptian life, influencing everything from art and architecture to both state and private religion. Reflecting the militaristic spirit of the time, royal imagery became heavily martial, with the king frequently depicted on temple reliefs as a mighty warlord. This emphasis on military prowess extended throughout society, marking the new kingdom as an era dominated by soldiers. From modest beginnings, the Egyptian military rapidly grew into one of the most influential sectors of society. In earlier periods, during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, Egypt's rulers had relied on conscripted armies, assembled as needed from the general population and supplemented by mercenaries, often recruited from Nubia. While this approach was sufficient for sporadic raids to defend national interests or open trade routes, it was inadequate for maintaining a vast empire. The conquest and annexation of foreign lands required permanent garrisons to enforce Egyptian rule, backed by the constant threat of overwhelming force to suppress any rebellion. Only a full-time standing army could meet these demands. Thus, at the dawn of the new kingdom, Egypt reorganized its military into a professional, permanent force. By the reign of Akhenaten, the military's influence extended deeply into the heart of government, with many of the king's closest allies holding both military and civilian positions, thereby securing a loyal and powerful support base for the throne. During the later 18th dynasty, the military was restructured into two primary branches: infantry and chariotry. Egypt also maintained a strong naval tradition, which had been particularly effective in battles against the Hyksos. The close integration of land and naval forces was reflected in the fluid assignment of soldiers and officers, who frequently rotated between army and navy roles. A major naval base operated at Memphis, the capital's port, while another, located at the former Hyksos stronghold of Hutweret, fittingly bore the name Perunefer, meaning good voyage. Military garrisons were likely stationed in provincial centers across the country to enable swift response during emergencies, while a sizable force of reservists near Memphis served as a deterrent to any internal threats. The basic tactical unit of the infantry was a platoon of 50 soldiers, led by a platoon commander, the lowest-ranking officer. Each platoon was divided into 5 squads of 10 men, each headed by its own squad leader. This structure encouraged teamwork and fostered strong unit cohesion, vital for military success. 4 or 5 platoons formed a company, which included a quartermaster and an adjutant, under the leadership of a standard-bearer. Companies could be grouped into battalions as operational needs dictated, and during major campaigns, battalions were consolidated into larger regiments or divisions, each commanded by a general and named after one of Egypt's state gods. The chariotry was similarly organized into units of 50, primarily led by officers, much like the cavalry of late 19th century European imperial armies. Life as an infantryman in the pharaoh's army might have offered chances for adventure and upward mobility, but it was far from easy. Even for volunteers, training was harsh and often involved indiscriminate beatings. Although a corps of military scribes managed records and distributed provisions, rations on campaign were extremely limited. Soldiers had to supplement their diet of bread and water through foraging or outright theft. It is hardly surprising that during the Battle of Megiddo, many Egyptian troops focused more on looting enemy supplies than capturing the town itself. Some soldiers likely hadn't had a full meal in weeks, nor could an infantryman simply walk away from such a grim existence. His only way out was death in combat or promotion through the ranks. Desertion was severely punished. If the conditions for Egyptian recruits were harsh, they were even worse for foreign prisoners of war forcibly conscripted into the ranks. These captives were branded, officially registered, and sometimes even circumcised as part of their forced assimilation into Egyptian culture. Only those who managed to survive years of active service could hope for an honorable retirement, farming a plot of land granted by the state. When the Egyptian army set out for battle, a soldier's basic gear included a pack, clothing, sandals, and a staff or cudgel for self-defense. Advanced weaponry was distributed only when battle was imminent, as warfare still revolved around set-piece confrontations. Before fighting began, soldiers removed their sandals and fought barefoot. Body armor was rare, as it restricted movement on the battlefield. Apart from a shield and perhaps a quilted leather jerkin, infantrymen had to rely on their agility, skill, and strength for protection. For long-range combat, bows and arrows were the preferred weapons. Simple bows came in various sizes, smaller ones for close-range skirmishes and longer versions for stationary formations of archers. Composite bows, introduced during the early New Kingdom, delivered greater penetration and were often reserved for officers. Archers selected different types of arrowheads based on the intended effect. Other ranged weapons included slings, spears, and javelins. In close combat, soldiers wielded clubs and fighting rods. Battle axes were ideal for hacking through enemy ranks, while scimitars allowed for powerful slashing attacks. The short dagger, used as a last resort, was also employed for a more grisly task. After battle, Egyptian soldiers tallied the dead by severing a hand from each fallen enemy. In one scene from the late 18th dynasty, triumphant Egyptian soldiers are shown departing the battlefield with 3 severed hands skewered on each of their spears. While the infantry formed the backbone of Egypt's military, the chariotry served as its elite strike force. The arrival of horses and chariots from Western Asia at the dawn of the New Kingdom revolutionized ancient warfare, providing Egypt with a highly effective weapon against large formations of enemy infantry. Each chariot was crewed by 2 men, a warrior armed with a bow and arrows, and a driver who also served as a shield-bearer. The chariot's light frame and rear-mounted wheels allowed for maximum speed and agility, making it ideal for breaking up enemy formations ahead of a main assault and for pursuing retreating foes to transform a withdrawal into a rout. This cutting-edge technology was not only a formidable weapon, but also a potent status symbol for Egypt's elite. Nevertheless, the 18th dynasty Egyptians turned this foreign invention into an instrument of conquest, using their chariot corps to subjugate province after province throughout the Near East. Without the chariot, Egypt's imperial ambitions might never have been realized. On campaign, chariots were privileges reserved for the officer class. For ordinary soldiers to enjoy such luxuries, they had to start at the lowest ranks and steadily climb the military hierarchy. The army offered determined and ambitious men a pathway to prestige and power. Few exemplify this better than Horemheb. Coming from a provincial background in Middle Egypt, his military career propelled him not only to the highest ranks of the army, but ultimately to the summit of the Egyptian state itself. Born during the reign of Amenhotep III, Horemheb's early years under Akhenaten remain obscure. However, subtle clues suggest that his talents were recognized early on, earning him advancement to senior positions. In the cliffs of Akhetaten, an unfinished tomb bears inscriptions for a king scribe and general named Patanemub. Since it was common for ambitious individuals to change their names during Akhenaten's reign to reflect the royal religion and eliminate references to older deities, it is quite plausible that Patanemub, the Aten's infestival, and Horemheb, Horus's infestival, were the same person. Horemheb may have adopted the name Patanemub during Akhenaten's rule, only to revert to his original name after Akhenaten's death. By the time Tutankhamun ascended the throne in 1332, Horemheb had risen to become commander-in-chief of the young pharaoh's army, a general of generals. Horemheb's grand private tomb at Saqqara is adorned with rich scenes depicting his role as supreme overseer of the army. Illustrated within are images of life inside a military camp, where messenger boys are shown running swiftly between tents, carrying orders from one officer to another. In other scenes, Horemheb receives desperate emissaries from famine-stricken foreign lands, who beg for mercy, throwing themselves to the ground in repeated acts of submission. prostrating 7 times on the belly and 7 times on the back. More disturbing are the depictions of prisoners of war from Horemheb's campaigns in the Near East and Nubia. Captives stand in long rows before the commander-in-chief, awaiting their fate. Asiatic prisoners, restrained with wooden manacles and ropes around their necks, are paraded before Egyptian soldiers, who push and herd them into position. As part of standard military policy, entire families were taken from their homelands and brought to Egypt as hostages, serving as leverage to ensure the compliance of their countrymen. Even more degrading treatment was reserved for the Nubian inhabitants of Kush, Egypt's most frequent adversary. The Kushite leader is shown groveling before Horemheb, while his men are harassed and humiliated by Egyptian soldiers, who beat them with sticks and strike them in the face. Throughout these scenes, army scribes meticulously document every detail with characteristic military precision. This display of merciless authority won Horemheb favor beyond the military ranks. In pharaonic Egypt, such qualities also opened doors to the highest levels of government. Like many top officers, Horemheb successfully combined military leadership with a prominent role in civil administration. While commanding Tutankhamun's army, he also served as the young pharaoh's protector. As the king's deputy over the entire land, and the one who conveys the king's words to his court, Horemheb wielded tremendous influence over state affairs. Operating from his seat in Memphis, he likely played a key role in steering the country back toward religious orthodoxy. The inscriptions in his tomb conspicuously omit any mention of Tutankhamun's name. As the power behind the throne, the commander-in-chief was already guiding the nation toward military rule as a means to restore stability. His many titles reflected this authority, declaring him the two eyes of the king in leading the two lands and establishing the laws of the two banks. It would not be long before Horemheb completed his rise, transitioning from royal deputy to assume the highest office as king himself. At the time of Tutankhamun's sudden death in 1322, Horemheb was far away on campaign in Syria, leading Egyptian forces in an unsuccessful attempt to retake the rebellious city of Kadesh and wrest it from Hittite control. The details of his involvement in the shadowy events that followed remain unclear. Perhaps Horemheb preferred it that way. Even if Ice's unexpected ascension temporarily blocked his path, Horemheb knew that Ice's advanced age meant his reign would not last long. After years spent carefully building his power base and waiting patiently, Horemheb could afford to bide his time a little longer before claiming the throne. When he finally ascended as ruler of the two lands, following Ice's short 4-year reign, 1322 to 1319, Horemheb's rise may have seemed inevitable. He had already been named Tutankhamun's successor and was simply fulfilling what the royal narrative would later present as his rightful destiny. This was surely the version promoted by the palace propagandists. In truth, however, a commoner with no royal lineage taking the throne marked a radical departure from tradition, posing a threat to the very principle of hereditary kingship. In effect, Horemheb's rise to power was nothing short of a military coup. But as a shrewd strategist, he fully recognized the risks and understood that securing his rule would require not only legitimizing his kingship, but also redefining the monarchy itself. Even with the army's backing, establishing a new order for Egypt would demand all of his political skill. His first priority, as always, was to secure divine endorsement for his reign. Horemheb achieved this brilliantly by timing his coronation to coincide with the annual Opet festival in Thebes. Emerging from the sanctuary of Luxor Temple, newly crowned and imbued with divine power through communion with Amuniasare, he presented himself as the chosen ruler. In such a setting, who could dare question his right to the throne? Once firmly seated on the throne of Horus, Horemheb tasked his priests and scribes with crafting a convincing narrative to explain how a military commander had come to rule Egypt. The result was a masterful piece of religious and political fiction. The official story claimed that from childhood, Horemheb had been divinely chosen and protected by his local deity, Horus of Heracleopolis, who acted as his father and guardian, preserving him until the destined moment arrived. A generation and another passed by, while his father kept him safe, knowing the day would come when he would retire and hand over the kingship to him. According to this account, Horemheb's long service in both the military and civil administration was all part of a divine plan. When the appointed time arrived, Horus elevated his chosen servant and entrusted him to the protection of Ammonius-Ra. In this way, a provincial youth rose to become ruler of the two lands. Both the timing and location of Horemheb's coronation deliberately evoked the splendor of Amenhotep III's reign. This was no accident. A central part of Horemheb's strategy for legitimizing his rule involved erasing the reigns that had followed Amenhotep III, allowing him to present himself as the first legitimate pharaoh since Egypt's dazzling orb. To achieve this, Akhenaten's temples at Gempeten were systematically dismantled, with their stones reused in Horemheb's own building projects. Work crews were dispatched to Akhetaten to eliminate all traces of the heretic king. Statues of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were torn down, shattered, and discarded outside the great Aten temple. Tutankhamun and I were also targeted for official condemnation. The boy king's inscriptions and monuments were reinscribed with Horemheb's name and titles, enabling him to claim sole credit for the restoration of orthodoxy. The elderly courtier who had once blocked Horemheb's ascent, received even harsher treatment. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings and his public monuments were defaced to ensure his memory would vanish, denying him any hope of an afterlife. In the end, after a lifetime of rivalry, Horemheb emerged victorious, restoring the temples, reinstating their offerings, and replenishing their priesthoods were all crucial steps in steering Egypt back to its traditional course. But Horemheb's counter-revolution extended beyond religion. As was customary for Egyptian rulers, he announced his governing philosophy through the Horus name he adopted at his accession, Mighty Bull, whose counsels are penetrating. The emphasis on law and order was intentional. Building upon his earlier role in establishing the laws of the two banks under Tutankhamun, Horemheb now issued a sweeping series of legal reforms, formalized through an edict. One of the most comprehensive surviving examples of pharaonic legislation, the decree sought both to curb abuses of power by government officials and to strengthen the stability of Horemheb's regime. While the preamble employed the familiar lofty rhetoric, the measures that followed were entirely practical. They reflect a ruler deeply rooted in military discipline, intent on governing Egypt with similar rigor. For out of the 10 edict clauses established strict penalties for the misuse of authority by palace agents. Anyone caught seizing boats or workers assigned to state projects faced severe punishment. Exile to the remote border fortress of Tjaru and facial disfigurement. Government officials caught embezzling would lose their noses. Corrupt palace staff were not spared. Fraudulent tax assessments, excessive demand for fodder that impoverished the people, or extortion of local mayors during royal tours were all outlawed. Even the military was held to these strict standards. Any soldier caught stealing hides to supplement his equipment would be subjected to brutal penalties: 100 lashes, 5 open wounds, and the confiscation of the stolen goods. After addressing official corruption, Horemheb turned his legislative focus to reforming the legal system. Cleansing the judiciary has long been a favored tactic of authoritarian rulers, particularly those with military backgrounds, and Horemheb followed this familiar path. He appointed a host of new judges, individuals expected to be attentive to the words of the court and the laws of the judgment hall. To further reinforce judicial integrity, he decreed that any local official found guilty of obstructing justice would face execution. As he proclaimed, "My Majesty has done this to strengthen the laws of Egypt." In his reign, the king's word was absolute law. The final set of measures in Horemheb's edict perhaps reveal his priorities most clearly, as they focused on his own security. One provision imposed new restrictions on the movements and activities of the royal harem staff. The 10th and final clause was even more forthright, granting additional rewards to members of the king's personal bodyguard. It will be as if every day were a festival for them, each man seated and receiving his share of every good thing, praise for his service, with gifts cast to them from the window, and each man called by name. From then on, the royal bodyguards would enjoy extra benefits from the king's personal wealth on top of their standard rations provided by the state treasury. In return, a new protocol was instituted within the inner palace, ensuring strict control over who could access the royal chambers and making certain everyone knew and observed their proper place. Horemheb was determined to leave nothing to chance when it came to his own safety. Having risen to power through military strength, he had no intention of falling victim to violence himself. The edict left no doubt. He was a courageous and vigilant ruler. Through these measures, Horemheb succeeded in solidifying his authority and securing the legitimacy of his reign. He brought military discipline to bear on a nation that had been weakened by 3 decades of political instability and uncertainty. Yet one problem remained. He had no heir. Without children to inherit the throne, Horemheb faced the risk that his hard-won reforms could be undone by a contested succession. His solution followed the same model that had led to his own rise. Among his closest confidants, he identified a successor from within the military ranks. Paramesu was a soldier through and through. The son of a battalion commander, he had begun his career as a common soldier, earning an officer's commission, then rising through the ranks to fortress commander, aide-de-camp to the king, and eventually general. He was cut from the same cloth as Horemheb, sharing both a similar background and outlook. Even more advantageous, Paramesu already had a son, and a grandson was on the way. Horemheb carefully prepared Paramesu for succession by appointing him to a series of high civilian offices, naming him king's deputy and vizier. At the same time, he required Paramesu to relinquish his military positions while Horemheb continued to command the army. Transferring control of such a powerful institution, even to a trusted subordinate, would have been unwise. Yet by granting Paramesu the titles of king's son and hereditary prince, Horemheb made his intention to pass on the throne unmistakably clear. As his reign drew to a close, Paramesu adopted the name Ramesu, beloved of Ammonius, and began inscribing his name within a royal cartouche. The transition to the Ramesside dynasty had begun. Although Horemheb paved the way for the new dynasty, its first ruler viewed himself as the true founder. To emphasize this new beginning, Ramesu, now known as Ramesses I, deliberately chose a throne name reminiscent of Ahmose, founder of the 18th dynasty. While Ahmose's name meant Ra is Lord of Strength, Ramesses adopted the name Menpethera, meaning Ra is enduring in strength. Yet his reign would prove short-lived. Already an elderly man at his accession, Ramesses I entrusted much of the kingdom's administration to his son Seti. This proved a wise choice. Just 18 months after taking the throne, Ramesses I died. His successor, Seti I, was a vigorous, energetic ruler, tall, athletic, and distinguished in appearance, with high cheekbones and the prominent aquiline nose that became characteristic of the Ramesside line. Thanks to Horemheb's legal reforms, royal authority was firmly re-established and corruption rooted out, allowing Seti to focus on restoring Egypt's strength and prestige both domestically and abroad. Prosperity and stability had long been demonstrated through grand state construction projects, and for the next 10 years, the land resounded with the sounds of masons' chisels and the calls of laborers as Seti I launched an ambitious series of new monuments at important sites across Egypt. Not since the reign of Amenhotep III had government architects and artists been so fully employed. Seti's most ambitious endeavor was a magnificent temple at Abydos, the ancient cradle of kingship and the sacred center of the Osiris cult. The temple's design introduced a bold new architectural plan and a strikingly inclusive dedication. Behind a columned hall, itself fronted by 2 grand courtyards, lay not a single sanctuary but 7, each devoted to one of Egypt's chief deities, the divine family of Horus, Isis, and Osiris, the solar gods Ammonius and Urahorikti, patron of Memphis and craftsman, and finally, as might be expected, Seti himself, Additional chambers were set aside for the Memphite funerary gods Nefertiti and Ta-Sokher, ensuring their inclusion. By bringing Egypt's foremost gods together under one roof to honor him, Seti sought to reinforce the theological authority of the new Ramesside dynasty. The theme of dynastic legitimacy was emphasized further in a long corridor leading southward from the column hall. Exquisite reliefs there depicted Seti's eldest son, Prince Ramesses, reading from a papyrus scroll listing 67 royal ancestors, stretching back to Menes, the legendary founder of Egypt. This Abydos king list, drawn from ancient temple archives, served a religious rather than purely historical purpose. Its aim was to emphasize an unbroken succession of legitimate kings from the first dynasty to Seti I and his son, while deliberately omitting rulers deemed unworthy. The Hyksos, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and his three immediate successors were all excluded. In the religious context of royal ancestor worship, such tainted predecessors were best forgotten. Abydos became the spiritual center of Seti's rule, and he spared no effort in ensuring its eternal operation. First, he endowed the temple with extensive lands and resources, many located deep within conquered Nubia, where no local objections could arise. He also issued a sweeping decree, following Horemheb's precedent, to shield these resources from misuse by other state institutions. This directive, known as the Nori Decree, was carved into the side of a sandstone hill near the Third Nile Cataract beside a fortified outpost. It laid out the punishment for any fortress official, scribe, or agent who interfered with the annual shipments of produce from Kush to the temple. 100 lashes and a heavy fine. With these regular shipments of goods secured for the temple's treasury, Seti also turned his attention to ensuring a steady flow of gold, the ultimate symbol of wealth. He ordered the reopening of gold mines in Egypt's distant eastern desert and personally oversaw the mining operations and the transport of precious ore back to the Nile Valley. An inscription at a remote temple in the Wadi Bermia recounts his personal involvement, describing how the king surveyed the mountains and, finding the dry, waterless route a hardship for his workers, ordered wells to be dug in the mountains to relieve their thirst and restore their spirits under the scorching sun. Seti's innovative approach extended even to the preparation of his final resting place. This tomb became the longest and deepest ever constructed at Thebes and was the first to feature decoration on every surface. Walls, ceilings, and chambers were entirely adorned with exquisite paintings and carvings. This comprehensive decorative scheme set the standard for all subsequent royal tombs of the New Kingdom. Among its many wonders, one masterpiece stands out: the vaulted ceiling of the burial chamber, painted with astronomical motifs to resemble the heavens themselves. Though the Ramesside dynasty was still young, less than a decade old, Seti I harbored no doubts about the eternal nature of his legacy.